Hi class. All right, we're now looking at chapter 10. This is socio-emotional development in middle and late childhood. Again, this is from 6 to 7 to about 11 years of age, is that range. And what we find in this particular chapter is that, in this particular age, is that there's a greater awareness, greater self-understanding that's occurring during this time. They're more likely to use subjective inner states when they're defining who they are. They're also more likely to use comparisons, so they'll describe themselves as being nice, helpful, popular, those type things, which is kind of interesting. As we go through this chapter, we're going to see how that plays itself out throughout the rest of the chapter. Two things that I want to mention here in this chapter is self-esteem and self-concept. So self-esteem is our global, how we feel about ourselves globally, our global view of ourselves. Self-concept is how we feel about our ability to do math or play soccer or those things. And what happened was there was a time, this is, we're looking at industry versus inferiority and self-esteem. There was a time in America where we thought that it was really important for the children to have good self-esteem. And so, again, bearing in mind with Piaget's theory, we wanted to make sure they were industrious, and so that's when people were being promoted just because of their age. Fortunately, cooler heads have prevailed, and we realized, well, now we've got a high school graduate who can't read. And as a result of that, things have kind of changed with changes to our special education, trying to make sure that those children that graduate are successful, and that way they do have healthy self-esteem. Because what we're finding is that our kids had great self-esteem, but they were scoring lower than the rest of the world, not the rest of the world completely, but on standardized tests, they were scoring lower than their counterparts in Europe or in Asia, but we felt good about ourselves. So it was a real challenge for us. And now, again, those cooler heads have prevailed. And so ways to address this low self-esteem is first, identify the cause. I can't read, or I'm not good in soccer. Provide emotional support. Certainly you don't want to tell them, well, you just are no good at sports. That's just the way it is. You want to provide that emotional support to help them to be successful. And then you want to help them to achieve. So maybe getting a tutor or having a coach work with your child to be successful in that particular sport they want to do. And then, of course, helping them cope with the challenges associated with not being successful in an area and gaining those skills to become successful. What this does is this produces self-efficacy, and that's the belief that one can master a situation by learning those skills. Okay, I didn't know I had problems with math. I had a tutor, so now I know if I have problems in another area, this is the strategy I've got to follow in order to be successful. It's also self-regulation, and that's the deliberate effort to manage one's behavior. So it's learning those skills. And again, we talked about industry versus inferiority. And the key thing here is to learn those skills to be successful. And that's why special education, if you remember a couple chapters ago, we talked about special education. You've got an IQ here and your reading level is down here. Why is there this gap? So special education addresses that gap to help you to be successful. And so you have that sense of industrious, industry versus inferiority. I'm shooting over to things that I want to make sure that we talk about, that I really emphasize in class. Coping is a big thing. We live in a very stressful world these days, and teaching our children to be able to cope with stress. There's some specific strategies that they've got. The text addresses. First, reassure children of their safety. I think of children that live in homes with domestic violence, how important this is. Allow children to retell the event. They're processing it by retelling them. That's what I use play therapy for some children that are not able to communicate their feelings. Encouraging discussing disturbing feelings they have. Help them make sense And then the key thing is protect the child from re-exposure. And so in the case of domestic violence, it's preventing them from being exposed to that again, over and over and over again. Moral development. This was where Lawrence Kohlberg comes into the text. Lawrence Kohlberg was a kind of a contemporary of Piaget. Remember we talked about Piaget before with morality. There's heteronomous morality, transition, and then autonomous morality. Well, Kohlberg wanted to take a look at that. And so what he did is he used kind of Piaget's platform, and he would have these famous dilemmas, the famous Heinz dilemma. And that's a case where the Heinz dilemma is a man who, I'll just contemporize it for us, we'll just say he's a hardworking American, he's working part-time here and part-time there, can't get full-time employment, doesn't have insurance, he's a hardworking American, but he just doesn't have that much money. Wife is critically ill, doesn't have insurance because nobody will give it to him because of his part-time status, and so he goes to a pharmacist and asks them to treat his wife, and the pharmacist has this miracle pill that can do it, but it's $100,000 for a pill, and he's got to buy 7 of them, and he can't afford it, and so the pharmacist does not give it to him, and Heinz breaks in and steals the medication to cure his wife. Now the question is, Heinz is definitely guilty. You know, he walked in there, the video camera caught him. He's not a very sophisticated thief. And so the question is, what kind of penalty does he get? And so Kohlberg showed this to kids at different ages. And what he found is that they responded differently. So the first one is what they call pre-conventional reasoning. And that is where good and bad is interpreted in terms of external rewards and punishments. And so in this one, this is like very similar to Piaget's heteronomous morality. They obey because they fear punishment for disobedience. And then the stage 2 of that, there's 3 levels and 2 stages for each level, is be nice to others, they'll be nice to you. This is the thinking behind the process of their morality. Then we have conventional reasoning, and this is where we apply standards, but the standards are set by others. So it's by the parents. You know, they want to be a good boy or a good girl. Or they think about social anarchy. If we let everybody rob from this pharmacist, how bad things will be. And then post-conventional, and that is when they realize that conscious decisions sometimes transcend the law. In other words, why is that pill so expensive? We had a similar debate in Congress not too long ago about the cost of pharmaceutical goods being so expensive. So there's a social contract utility, evaluates the validity of the actual laws, and then there's a universal ethics, principles that conflict law and conscience. We should follow our conscience to make those decisions. Now there are critics to Kohlberg, right? First, the moral thought does not necessarily equal moral behavior, and that he thought it did. Bill Clinton, poor guy, he kind of personifies it. I bet you if they gave him a test and said, is it okay to have a sexual relationship with my intern while I'm married in the White House, he would have checked the no box. But we know that moral thought does not necessarily equal moral behavior. Cultural moral reasoning, unity and sacredness of all life forms. You know, for some religious beliefs will go that direction. Family processes are essential for development. Kohlberg and Piaget were not so keen on that. And then the other component was the gender and care perspective versus the justice perspective. And this is Carol Gilligan, who she said that, you know, this was very much a male view and didn't take into consideration a female's perspective being the care perspective. Let's see. They discuss pro-social behavior. If you've ever seen that film, Pay It Forward, that's kind of an example. Pro-social behavior is doing something without expecting something in return, just doing something kind. What we know is that it goes through different stages, like sharing the first years of life are usually out of fun or social ritual. Sharing at 4 years of age, there's some empathy involved in it, but there's also an obligation, like you will share your toys with your cousin. About 6 years of age, there's the fairness. Is it fair that I have more toys than they? And mid to late elementary children begin to realize that people with disabilities might have special merit. So if I broke my leg and was on crutches, why don't we let them kick the ball, but somebody else run the bases for them? Those type of things. Trying to see what else I want to maybe emphasize here. I do want to talk about this. Here we go. Gender stereotypes. We talked about gender last couple chapters ago, or maybe it was last chapter. Broad categories reflect general impressions and beliefs about females and males. Physical, there's definitely physical differences. Cognitive differences are not quite as extreme. Socio-emotional differences are usually the thing that's surprising to most people. With physical aggression being attributed, aggression being attributed to males and not females, but in fact we know that they're equally aggressive. It's just that males are more often physically aggressive and females are more often involved in relational aggression. Rachel Simmons, in her book Odd Girl Out, she was a Rhodes Scholar who was just an amazing young, well, everybody's young to me, but amazing psychologist who did some research on bullying. She's really brought it forward. Sandra Bem, too, is discussed here. She talks about gender role classification and androgyny, which sounds weird, but basically it's a person who's got both masculine and feminine traits, and they're comfortable in their skin. So, for example, I can't recall her name. She was a football player for Colorado University and was also their homecoming queen. So she's comfortable in doing both things. Sandra Bem, she kind of brought it to a new level, though. She thought that we should be teaching androgyny in the school. Not so sure about that, but they discuss step families, 3 types: stepfather, stepmother, blended families, and how they interact with each other. Peers, I do want to mention this thing, and this is probably where we'll call it an end for this chapter. Peer statuses, there's 5 of them in this category. There's the popular child, there's the average child, neglected child, rejected child, and controversial child. Now, I want to emphasize on the popular and the rejected child. So the popular children, when I ask somebody what makes somebody popular, they'll say, well, they have wealth or money, those type of things, or athletes. But what's interesting is that the rejected child, and I had a case that I worked on in this particular, for this particular, category, who was, he had threatened to shoot up a school and was sent to me. And what happened was he was kind of a quirky child. It wasn't a bad child, but it was just kind of quirky. He had low socioeconomic status, pretty dysfunctional family. But what I taught him was the skills to make him popular, which wasn't money or clothes or sports. It was communication, listening to others, being interested in what they have to say, not about what you have to say. And so when he went back to the school, it was like a 180-degree change in him. And so the school had called me up to say, thank you for bringing him back to school. He's now a popular child. So teaching them those skills can also help them address bullying. And so with that said, guys, that is just a brief overview of some key things that I'd like to talk about in this chapter. Thank you so much for your patience, guys.